Hello. It's my pleasure this week to bring you a thought for the week. It's just 5 minutes long-ish. I guess we'll find out. And I've had so many thoughts that I wanted to kind of bring it a little bit off the cuff because I think it'll feel a little bit more real if I do that. I've got my question for today, and it's, I guess, a very serious question, is about suffering. It's a question that skeptics of Christianity, skeptics of Christians will tend to point to. Why does suffering happen? Why, if there is a God, why does he allow it? And especially at a time like this when so many people are going through so much, the question remains, and I think that the important thing to say first is that it is a relevant question and it is a fair question for believers to answer, is why does a God allow suffering to happen? And so I want to kind of address it not flippantly. I don't want to address it in any way that would make it seem belittled or easy to answer, because it's not an easy question to answer. Perhaps for some people it's the hardest question to answer in coming to faith. But I do want to look at a window into an insight that might begin to answer the question. And so ultimately when we come to suffering, there's two ways of looking at it. You have a worldview, one side or the other, that ultimately is going to affect how you see it. For those of us who have faith, we believe in a God who's in control. We believe in a God who is sovereign. And therefore we have to answer the question, why does he allow these things to happen? We have to approach it and say, well, if he is in control, then he is given permission for these things to take place. There's a second worldview that you might bring to this. You might be a skeptic. You could be agnostic. Perhaps you're an atheist. Perhaps you've never really thought about it before. If you're in that worldview, then what Richard Dawkins says about the universe that you live in, and perhaps you've not thought about it before, perhaps you have. Richard Dawkins says that this universe is indifferent. He says that it's pitiless, and ultimately at the bottom of it all, Richard Dawkins says that the universe we live in is meaningless. So he's taking all of the things that we hold dear, our lives, our friends, our family, ultimately putting it down to meaninglessness. In fact, if you take that worldview, then I guess we have to see ourselves as ultimately rearranged pond scum, just a collection, a bag of chemicals, a bag of atoms, which is slowly self-assembled into what you find today. And if you believe that, of course, that's your prerogative to do that. If you believe that, however, what you've done, I suppose you've removed the question altogether. You haven't dealt with the question of suffering and why it happens, but you have taken a question out of the picture, because in a meaningless universe, why should we care that there's suffering? The universe is pitiless and indifferent, so how have we got to a point where there's creatures like us that actually care about such things? So I would challenge you, if you're in that worldview, I guess, to forget all about it. Why does suffering even matter? But for those of us who have got faith, and I have said this already, it's important that we do address the question, that we wrestle with it, that we're not flippant about it, and we don't belittle the question of suffering. And so for me, the question that remains is, if we do find ourselves in a world where there's suffering, and if it does matter, and there's something deeply rooted in me that says that this does matter, that people matter and life matters, then is there any evidence that the God we believe in cares? Is there any evidence that he is willing to do something about it? And of course, I can't go into an answer. I mean, I've got lots of thoughts on it, and I'd love you to get in touch if you'd like to hear more or question it. But there is a small window that I'd like to look through. That is that God himself could have been like the universe that Richard Dawkins believes in. God could be indifferent. I guess he could be pitiless. I guess he could see it as unimportant and meaningless. But that's not the God that I find in Scripture. That's not the God that I find in the Bible. Something we've been looking at over Easter in the crucifixion of Jesus. History tells us that Jesus was a real person. History tells us through Jewish sources, Roman sources, the Bible sources, that Jesus existed and that Jesus was crucified. And in John 19, in verses 17, it says this: "And he, bearing his cross, went out to a place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him, and two others with him, one on either side, and Jesus in the centre." It's a really simple bit of scripture. It's just part of the narrative that makes up John's gospel. But what does it tell us? It tells us that Jesus, a real historical person, was crucified at Calvary. And for what purpose? Well, actually, the insight that I'm taking from it is that whereas God could have remained distant, the Bible tells us that he stepped into history and was crucified. He became part of human suffering rather than staying away from it. In fact, not only did he take on suffering for himself, he took on our greatest problem that we could face, which is sin. And Jesus on the cross triumphs over that sin and solves our greatest need. It doesn't belittle the problem of suffering. It doesn't give an answer to every circumstance that we face, but it gives us hope that the God that we trust in, the God that we believe in, is compassionate on his creation, cares about his creation, and has taken steps in history that evidences that for us. And so my encouraging thought, hopefully, is to wrestle with it a little bit, think about it. Jesus tells us elsewhere in John's Gospel that while we will have tribulations and trials in the world, to take heart because he has overcome the world. And so I hope that this week, when you have the chance to think, when you have the chance to read, whether you're a skeptic or whether you're somebody who's a believer, that you'll think about that question for yourself, address it for yourself, and be comfortable and clear on the God that we believe in. And I hope that you have a great week.